My guest today was raised among the fjords and mountains of the Norwegian west coast, where he developed a strong connection to nature. I should say I've stolen this bio from his LinkedIn profile. He realized that the world was bigger than the valley where he grew up, and he decided to move to travel alone to Brisbane in Australia to study business, which is really interesting because that's exactly my experience too. Traveled alone to Brisbane to study business. After finishing his Bachelor of Business and a Master of Journalism, he found love, married an Australian girl, and decided to stay. Throughout his career, he's been involved in Q Fleet's early electrification trials, and later on in his career also became their EV ambassador. And of course, these days, Q Fleets is probably regarded as one of the leaders in fleet electrification in Australia. He's the Queensland representative on the National EV Action Plan Implementation Group, which is assisting the federal government in developing a program for EV education and awareness. He recognizes the importance of charging and EV integration and how that's important to really address a lot of the barriers for EV adoption in Australia. I recently just met him for the first time a couple of weeks ago up in Brisbane. I was there for a conference where he gave a presentation on the Norwegian EV journey, which is really interesting. Welcome to the Charging Sessions podcast, Bjorn Siem.
Hello, Johan.
Good day. How you doing?
Brilliant. It's a nice rainy day in Brisbane today, so it's nice and cool for a change.
That is nice to hear for a change, because down here in Geelong, it's nice and sunny today. So it's nice to hear that we got a reverse of fortunes for once.
I know, it's a bit unusual, put it this way.
Yeah, and it's a little bit strange actually to speak English with you, because I think in one regard we probably both speak better professionally in English than we do in our mother tongue, whether that's Norwegian or Swedish. But when we caught up in Brisbane, we spent a lot of time speaking Swedish, because you've got a Swedish background too, yeah?
Yes, so my grandfather was Swedish, or has a Swedish background. So grew up basically traveling to Sweden and with Swedish friends, and obviously Norwegian and Swedish are very similar anyway. So kind of, yeah, you get it all in basically when you're in Norway.
Yeah, that's right. Actually, on that topic, whereabouts in Norway did you grow up? I talked about the fjords and the west coast, but where specifically in Norway?
Yeah, I was born in Oslo, but I quickly moved over to the west coast and northwest coast, around Ålesund, Kristiansund area. Lived on a little island there for a little while, and then moved into my parents' strawberry farm, where in the top of the Trollstigen, in the middle of the fjords and mountains. Very scenic and beautiful place where we still have a cabin that we go back to as often as we can.
Nice. Well, every Norwegian pretty much have a cabin. It's something we often joke about in Sweden, but we're of course very jealous of, because it does seem very idyllic to have a place to go to in summer and winter.
It's wonderful. It's basically like a retreat, where you can get back in, get close to nature, and to me it's basically back to my roots, where my family is from, and it's where I just enjoy spending especially time in summer, where there's lots of trails and mountains to climb around. So it's definitely somewhere I probably retire at some point.
Nice. That sounds good. Well, tell us a bit. How did you end up in Queensland? Like what made you go, I'm keen to see something different, try something different, go and study in Queensland? What was the idea behind that?
I think I realized when I was quite young that I wanted to see the world, and I traveled around the world after I finished my military service in Norway, and spent about a year. Only spent about a week in Sydney at the time, and then traveled around. Spent 6 months in the Cook Islands, and just loved the lifestyle and the weather. And when I got back to Norway, I realized I wanted an English degree, so I looked at a couple of different options, the UK and US, mainly because that would allow me to travel and go anywhere in the world essentially. And Brisbane looked really nice. It looked like it was just next to the beach on the map, and it was just a beautiful subtropical climate, and 300 sunny days a year, which was very enticing at the time.
Yeah, not bad, is it? And I had that experience too. I was like, oh, it's right by the beach, before you realize that in reality, it's probably a good 50 minutes or an hour to a decent one, unless you want to go to South Bank and go with the kids in the pool that's warm for other reasons than just the sun. Yeah,
absolutely.
That's awesome. I remember when I just when I was packing up to move, I had a similar experience, and I actually didn't really know what I wanted to study. Then I was like, I was traveling, sort of, I was working after high school. Then I went traveling, met some great friends, and decided this seems like a really good place to go to uni. I don't know what I want to do. Let's do business. It's always a good background to have. And then I was, I had to go back to Sweden, do a bit of extra studies to get into the course I wanted to get into. But then, as I was packing up to move to go and do this degree, I was going through like my boy bedroom in Sweden, and I had this cap collection. I used to collect like American trucker hats for a while when I was a kid, and things like that. And I was going through and I was boxing stuff up in my parents' house. And at the very bottom, I find this travel magazine from Queensland. I think it's from like 1994 or something like this. And so I had this sort of suspicion of, well, actually, did this kind of happen by accident, or have I kind of had this idea for a longer time and it's kind of just escaped me? But it's interesting how life kind of, you have an experience, and then all of a sudden you find yourself on the other side of the world.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's something that's been ruminating in the back of your mind, I think. Yeah, since the
Yeah.
beginning. Yeah, I basically, my mum's only ever given me one piece of advice about women, and that was before I went to Australia. She said, "Don't meet an Australian girl." And what do? You meet an Australian girl and you stay. So my parents probably never been very happy with with that, but hey, that's life.
That's life. And something I always say is that my parents also complain about that a bit, but the reality is we're only a day away from that part of the world if we need to go home for whatever reason. So same for them, if they want to come here, it's just a day. So it's not too much of an effort if you perhaps just put aside that horrible travel experience that you can have.
That's true.
Tell me about how did you get into electric vehicles in the first place?
Yeah, it was a bit chance, I think, like most things are. You're young, you get out of uni and you apply for a couple of different things, and ended up getting a job in Q Fleet, which is the Queensland Government's fleet manager. And essentially just worked myself up there, and it was part of the electric journey in the early 2010s, 2011s, until we had a change of government. But before then, we drove. I remember driving the first electric car in 2010, which was a little Mitsubishi i-MiEV, which was not very exciting at the time, but it was very quiet and very different and exciting. And then we heard about things like vehicle to grid at the time, which just blew my mind the first time I heard it. I couldn't believe it. Like, you can actually power your house or have power the grid from your car. That was just amazing. So a lot of those things basically happened back then, and then it took a bit of a backseat until we started, I think around 2020, we started the journey back into transitioning to electric vehicles, partly because obviously there's a lot more electric vehicles available. And then we had a change of government, which essentially mandated a transition to electric vehicles for all passenger vehicles. And I was part of that, implementing those policies. So like you, I guess I've turned into a bit of an energy nerd over the years through electric vehicles. Because one thing I realized, and as my role was assisting government agencies rolling out electric vehicles, was that the vehicles, when people got into them, they were like, "Oh, yep, I can find my indicator. Yep, that's my drive selector. Cool, I can just put in, I can drive it." Most people, I've had hundreds of people basically take their first EV drive with me, and I realized after a time that the vehicles were no longer the problem. The vehicles were good enough, they had long enough range, they were comfortable enough, they had enough space to do whatever you needed. The issue was charging. And that's basically dropped me into the rabbit hole of energy, and how the energy system is supporting charging, or will have to support charging at some point. And so I made a transition to energy about a year and a half ago now to help with that.
Awesome. And it's really interesting, because I think we come from, I've probably come more from the energy industry, and have sort of transitioned more into the EV space these days. But I think it's such an important kind of be able to have, wear the hat of both the energy and EV industries, because they're so interrelated. And in particular, when we get to vehicle to grid, vehicle to home, which we'll talk about a little bit in a few minutes, but it's such an interesting change, and it's such a transformative change, because if you look at the way that the grid is, I guess the how the grid is changing, how energy storage is becoming a bigger and bigger share of that grid, and how consumer energy storage, probably in the next 5, 10, 15 years is going to play a huge role. So I think it's fantastic that you're getting into the energy space, and I think your experience in the EV industry in particular will benefit those you work with. You talked about charging. Would you say is that the number one thing that Australia can kind of learn from Norway to expedite EV transition, or what do you think Australia could do better to maybe be a little bit more like Norway?
Yeah, it's a great question, because obviously Norway is far ahead in its EV transition now, with 25% of all cars on the road being electric, as well as this year probably it will overtake the number of petrol cars on the road. So it's a significant change, obviously, with 90+% of all EVs being electric as well. I think there's a number of things that we could do, because we're obviously not Norway, and a lot of the things that Norway has done, for instance, cutting GST, where GST is 25% of all for all EVs, is probably not something that we could compete with. But at a higher level, and especially because we're a little bit further down the road now, and the cost of EVs, yes, they're still more expensive, but we also have the benefit of a lot of cheap EVs coming on the market, and probably more so in the next year or two, which will bring us very close to price parity. I think it's more around the how do we actually roll out EVs, and EV charging in particular, consistently and cohesively across the country. And that requires something that they do really well in Norway, which is essentially it's cooperation between all levels of government, but they include DNSPs as well in that discussion. And that feeds into a national charging strategy, where essentially every time a road or a street is developed or built, basically EV charging is always considered. Even if they don't put in charging, they at least put in facilities to make charging available or make it easy to install. So a lot of these things I think can be done, and it's starting to happen, but it's still early days.
Yeah. Okay. And so what are we talking about here? Are we talking about building, the backbones of ultra fast DC charging across the whole country, or is it something different?
That's part of it, basically, and that's already happening by the NRMA is doing it. But what actually Norway did particularly, they're actually more focused on the vehicles rather than the cars, because you can have as many fast chargers as you want out there. If you can't afford an EV, then it doesn't really make much of a difference. So what Norway did was essentially facilitate the vehicles getting out there, and that also means that now that DC charging is essentially covered by the private sector. Very little money, actually, in the scheme of things, went to implementing EV charging versus getting vehicles on the road.
Okay. Yeah. Interesting. And I'm guessing too that when we've got all these big changes happening, both with, say, the US imposing big tariffs or duties on Chinese vehicles, with the national vehicle emission standard coming in from next year, it seems that there's quite a few things that are happening around the world that's actually going to mean that we're going to have plenty of supply of low cost and affordable vehicles coming into Australia over the next few years. What's your take on vehicle affordability over the next couple of years?
Well, in the last couple of years, basically what we're seeing is that the EVs keep coming down in price, and the internal combustion vehicles keep going up in price. So it's only a matter of time before you do have the price parity. And as you move further along, basically down the electrification journey, looking at what else the vehicle can do for you, like being a home battery or feeding power back into the grid. I keep on telling people that at some point the only reason you buy a combustion car is because you like the broom broom sound, and that's about it. Because it'll become a no-brainer to buy an EV, because it does all these things and it saves you money in so many ways that it just becomes it's the done deal, which has happened in Norway.
Yeah. No, that's a very good point, actually. The vroom vroom sound. What's your favorite electric vehicle on the market today, and why?
I have to admit, I drive a Tesla, and there's something about Teslas that just, I don't know, I think it brings out your inner child or something, that it's just somehow delightful in so many ways. Like, say what you want about Elon Musk and the like, but there is something about the Teslas that just, I don't know, they speak to me in terms of the fun and the delight. And my wife has a BYD, which is a great car, works really well, and it's really comfortable, does all the nice things, but it just doesn't have the, I don't know, the fun or the tech, advanced tech, basically that I enjoy, and the, the continual updates that we keep getting, as well as the new features and all these things that keep coming through. It's there's just something about it.
Yeah. No, I agree. Did you have the Model 3 or Model Y?
Yeah. Yeah, I got the Model 3. It was I bought it before the Model Y came out. I've driven the Model Y a lot through work, and it's a brilliant car. I probably would have gotten that one just purely for the space and but I do have the long range because I do kind of enjoy I made a mistake of test driving a dual motor long range and before I bought one, and then I couldn't go back, unfortunately.
Yeah. I can understand. I started with the Model 3, very much enjoy that. But for me, one of the biggest reasons for going with the Tesla when I did was the fact that it started coming out with the LFP batteries in the rear-wheel drive models, which really appealed to me. I had the Model 3 at first, then the innovative lease change came in, about a year and a half ago in Australia, which for me was, as a small business owner, a perfect opportunity to switch over to an innovative lease, which is where I got the Model Y. And I think both are amazing cars. Didn't have a single issue with either of them. And I think comparing that to some of my other experiences in electric cars, there's a lot of great electric cars, but I think you're right, Tesla does have a different feel to them. Maybe, yeah, I think some of the technology might seem a little bit childish or weird or unusual, but I think a lot of it actually adds to the overall experience. Maybe not for you, but maybe for your kids, or maybe for others that are passengers. I mean, there's nothing more fun than to put the fart sound on when someone comes and sits in the back of the car. It's great.
It's brilliant. I love just embarrassing my kids just by having, emotional damage. It's blaring out of the external speaker when I pick them up from school. It's brilliant.
Yeah. That's right. They'll have a very different view on their childhood compared to what we had with playing with sticks and floats in the creeks.
Yep, and the back of the Volvo 240 station wagon.
Well, it was 740, I think, in the case of my
Nice.
my grandparents. Yeah. I'm actually at the moment. I'm sitting in a room in my office here, and I'm not don't want to say I'm surrounded by Norwegian EV chargers, but I've got a few in the room that I'm in. So I'm quite partial to some of the Nordic EV charging that's available out there, in particular in Europe. Do you have any favorites as far as charging is concerned? Maybe on the AC side?
Not so much in the AC. I'd got a few experiences with a few chargers, but I have two Tesla wall connectors at home, mainly because it has the button that releases the cable from a Tesla, which makes it a lot easier, and they work really well. Plus, I can control them through my app, which just makes it easier. But we've had some great experiences with some auxiliary units and things like that through work. And there's obviously a lot of others out there, and especially in the Norwegian space. Just going back to Norway, you see the variety of chargers that all sit outside in the middle of winter and it's minus 30 and they still work, and it's very impressive the kind of the quality that they produce there.
Yeah.
Same thing with the DC chargers. Like I think Kempower is a brilliant company that produce some really good chargers, and especially they have a distributed type charger where basically we have one power unit that supplies just satellites of charging cables, which I think is brilliant because it just makes so much sense for especially a charging site where you have multiple outlets, and you don't have one vehicle sitting there on a 350 kilowatt charger basically plunking in 10 kilowatts because it's at 95%. Having like a distributed one unit charger basically with lots of satellites makes a lot more sense to me.
Yeah, totally. I agree, and I think the way that Kempower kind of thinks about not just making the whomever the charge point operator is, like they typically have a really good experience as far as the customer experience is concerned. But then Kempower have that additional customer experience where you can just scan a QR code and get take your charging with you when you go into the shopping center or whatever it might be. I think they've done a great job there. So I think hats off to our Nordic neighbors in Finland on creating a really good charger there. I think definitely one of the leaders in the DC space, and there's so many good AC chargers from Norway as well, and actually Sweden too, not too bad. I think the whole of Nordics, I think, really beats a lot of the competition around the world, which is great to see.
Just waiting for IKEA to bring out an EV charger now.
Yeah, totally. I mean, who knows? Might have it. They're certainly active in the EV space, which is great to see.
Absolutely.
On the topic of charging, and I guess charging becoming more and more a part of the grid and the electricity supply, vehicle to grid, vehicle to home, super interesting space. This obviously you even have vehicle to load, like I'm sure you do in your BYD. Who do you see as the world leader right now in terms of countries that are adopting vehicle to grid, vehicle to home? And do you think that Australia might start to see some interesting offerings in this space in the next little while?
Absolutely. I'm incredibly excited about the vehicle to grid and vehicle to home and the potential that it has to support, especially in Australia where we have, an abundance of solar during the day. And if we can find some way to soak that up and feed it back into the grid at peak, it's going to make a world of difference. So there's always a fair few trials and work being done overseas, like Netherlands, for instance, and I know Sweden's got a few trials, Norway to an extent too. But for instance, in Norway, it's I don't suspect it's that big because the difference, obviously, when you run off hydro mainly, basically, it's a fairly stable energy market and the prices don't fluctuate as much. Versus, with a more and more renewable wind and solar in particular, you will have more fluctuation in terms of pricing and which again will make that a lot more valuable, I think. So we have a massive opportunity here in terms of rolling it out, and it's just a matter of how do we roll it out safely? How do we get it in people's hands and make sure that people get value out of it as well? Because there's a lot of fingers in the pie. A lot of people, I think, want to make money on this, but at the end of the day, it should be the person who's you bought the car, who is providing the energy to the grid of their own free will, that should be benefiting the most from it.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting point. I think it's kind of at the moment it feels a little bit like there's a bit of a battlefield out there as to who's going to benefit the most. Is it going to be the manufacturer of the car? Is it going to be the electricity network? It's going to be the electricity retailer? How do you kind of weave together a value proposition to the customer where they go, this is something that I want, this is something that I'll benefit from, and I appreciate the incentives in the market, which perhaps means that I can share some of the benefits of this resource. I think that's really the one of the key things is like what's that kind of recipe where consumers go, yeah, I'm keen to make this investment.
Exactly. And again, it'll just be another reason to get an EV, and it's no longer just something that transports you around. It's something that can provide so much more benefit to you, and just simple things like vehicle to load. We've had a few power cuts at our place, and we just basically plug into the power board of our BYD. We power the router and the TV, and we basically have Netflix, and we can keep the kids happy and wait for the power to come back. So it's just simple things like that make a big difference. And once you actually have like this massive battery sitting in your car in your garage, and why wouldn't you use them to create a bit of value when you're not using the vehicle?
Yeah, totally. And I think that's the thing too. It's like, and then once you're able to kind of access that resource in your car, it will in effect have an impact on the price of that car and move it even closer to parity. Because if the value of that battery is maybe $5,000 more than the cost of the charging infrastructure to unlock it, then all of a sudden you're getting closer and closer and closer to that parity. And perhaps we're soon in the world where it's cheaper to buy an EV because with all the value you can get from it.
Yeah, exactly. And the challenge is essentially it's educating people on the benefits of it as well. And that's something that someone actually asked me a while ago, what keeps you up at night? And it's essentially, how do we cross the chasm? It's a software term from crossing the chasm from early adopters to early majority. How do we do that with EVs? And essentially, it is about making it as easy and as practical and as true and tried and tested, as possible for essentially the early majority, which are pragmatists who want someone else to try it first before they pick it up, and they want to have it easy and simple and integrated. And that's, I think, the challenge is essentially getting people across, what the benefits are and packaging in the way that makes it super simple to pick up. And a lot of times just you take it out of people's hands as well. Like you say, hey, you get this car, you plug it in, and we'll do the rest. That's going to be the big selling point at some point.
Yeah, no, absolutely. No, it's easy for us early adopters and energy nerds to maybe get caught up in, is this going to be AC vehicle to grid? Is going to be DC vehicle to grid? Is the hardware going to be in the car? It's going to be mostly on the outside of the car. But I think the reality is that it's all about just making it easy for people to adopt the technology. So it's kind of like, what does that package look like that will enable that? And I think if someone else is able to either take the risk or take the costs of implementing it, and then create a really compelling value proposition to the customer, I think they'll probably be at the forefront of as we start adopting this over the next few years.
Yeah, absolutely. And the challenge there is also basically making sure everyone's on the same page. Like for instance, in Norway, you have the right to charge legislation, which essentially means that anyone who rents or lives in an apartment basically can get charging where they live. Some people ask me, hey, does it mean that you can just rock up to someone's house and ask for a charge? And that's not how it works. It's essentially just so that body corporates can approve or have confidence in approving EV charging where people live.
That's a really interesting one, because it's, I know you touched on this at your presentation the other week, and I think it's, one point that gets way too much attention out there is the danger of an EV fire, right? It's something that either seems to scare people that work in the building space, and which then scares a lot about the corporates or building owners. Can you tell us a bit about just how safe an EV is compared to a normal car?
Absolutely. It's something that I can probably do a whole podcast on EV fires. It's something I've gone into and studied extensively. Also, when I was back in Norway, I did talk to the Norwegian fireys, as well as a number of Norwegian councils as well. And when I asked them about fire safety, they laughed and said, yeah, 10 years ago, we were worried about that. But now there's no restrictions. You can put chargers any way you like. And we know how to handle them, because we know that they are actually much, much less of a risk than internal combustion engines. And I used just an analogy that, you most likely sleep next to a lithium-ion battery every night in your mobile phone. You most likely have a lithium-ion battery in your watch if you have a smartwatch. You probably also have a battery in the remote for your TV. Are you worried about the remote of your TV exploding? Most people don't. And what most people don't know is obviously that vehicle batteries are a much higher grade. They also they're much better protected, and they also have a much better battery management system than any of those other devices that you have. So what I'm trying to tell people is that the issue here isn't the batteries, basically, because in my opinion, batteries are inherently safe. The issue here is basically, how do we protect the world or our buildings from internal combustion fires, basically, because that is a much greater risk here. And if anything can come of this transition to EVs, is that we get safer car parks. That's great, but let's not overbuild any car parks because there are EVs there, or put all these restrictions in, because none of that is happening in Norway. And they made that decision based on evidence and also experience. And it is very, very interesting, because, as I mentioned, the right to charge, in the right to charge legislation, basically, it says that that you can't refuse right to charge based on fire safety, because the Norwegian government basically says that, based on our experience and independent studies, there's not an increased risk to have EVs parking anywhere. So there's a lot of work being done both in Norway and Scandinavia and Sweden on this, and a lot of studies being taken care of. And when I talked to the Norwegian fireys, they basically said that we know how to handle these. Basically, if it's an EV fire or not an EV fire, we know how to handle it. It's not a big difference. And in most instances, the battery is not even involved in an EV fire. Yeah. For instance, we know from the Netherlands that only 38% of EV fires basically have the battery involved. So a lot of times it's just like any other vehicle fire. So the story that I tell people is that, imagine if you had all these like battery, that all the vehicles were currently battery powered. You have all these other devices featured by running on batteries. Now try to tell people, oh, we're going to put this vehicle in your garage that has all this full of flammable material called liquid fuel. It also has an electric system that can spark and that can ignite all this liquid fuel, and we'll put it in every home. Let's do that. It's a bit absurd to me, like how the worry around EVs, just because it has a lot of batteries, is more dangerous than what's inherently flammable. And hell of a lot more dangerous, basically, both based on the number of instances, but also the inherent risk within the technology.
Yeah, yeah, no, it's super interesting, and I really hope that a lot of that information and education gets passed on to some of the Australian landscape, because it does seem like on some fronts that people are taking precautions that are just not based on information. It's based on the being maybe scared of new technology that they don't understand. And so hopefully your message and the message of EV fire safe and a few of those people in the industry really gets more airtime, because it's really important not only that we try to catch up with the rest of the world when it comes to EV adoption, but that we make it easy for people to make the decision to go with an EV, in particular multi-residential homes where it's already hard enough, right, to get EV charging because of the corporate rules and all the rest of it. So it's, yeah, good on you for telling us a bit of that story and getting some of that information out there.
No, you're absolutely right. Because the issue is fear of the unknown. It's we don't, if we don't know it, or we don't have experience with it, people are naturally worried. So it's completely natural, but also then it's up to us to educate both ourselves and others about looking at the countries that have gone before and have encountered these issues and how they solved it. I think that's really important, rather than looking at everything that can potentially go wrong, and it's the risk basically. That, well, if you look at reporting on social media basically versus if you base a risk assessment on that, then obviously it will not reflect reality.
Yeah, and it's interesting that I've got a great interest in sort of disinformation around the energy transition and the e-mobility transition, and there's a lot of, I think, attempts to kind of hijack a lot of the discussion that's happening. And I think mass market media does have I know with your background as a journalist, you probably see this all the time too, where certain parts of the media might try to get us to think that a particular thing is happening. Just to pick something I saw today, I saw an image of a Tesla on fire, and the headline was something obviously around EV fires, and it's from 2GB radio, and it was kind of, I think, I didn't go to read the full thing or listen to the whole thing, but I have a feeling probably in the story that would talk about it, and it would probably be largely based on facts. But the fact that the way in which we absorb news today is a lot of the time we might read the headline, we might see the picture, and then move on, because there's so much information out there. And so I think media is really being dishonest when it tries to kind of hijack that low level of attention that we do have naturally because of information overload, by sending us a picture and a headline that doesn't actually correspond to the reality of the story.
Absolutely, and it's the basically the media has become more and more essentially profit centered, unfortunately. So anything that attracts clicks and attracts advertisers as well. So I think that's mainly the main thing, because if you put up anything about a car fire happened on the highway today, or a petrol car fire happened on the highway today, no one would care. But if there's an EV, basically it attracts attention, both from the people that are pro EV and against the EV. So it's very clever in a way, but it's not fruitful, or doesn't add to fundamentally to having a measured discussion on what is actually real versus the things that we tend to put forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, I'm mindful I've taken up a lot of your time. I just got one more question. So we'll have to do another podcast on fire safety in electric vehicles, because it is a really fascinating topic.
Absolutely, I can get a fire chief from Norway to come and have a chat to it.
Brilliant. Sounds good. I'll take you up on that. So we're currently sitting at probably just below the 10% mark in terms of EVs as a percentage of new car sales in Australia. I think the start of the year has been a little bit up and down on that front. I think last month was a bit low, but that might have other external factors. I think 2023 we're sitting at somewhere around the sort of 7.5% mark in total. Where do you see the number at the end of the year for EV sales, and perhaps over the next few years?
It's a very good question, because obviously we had exponential growth in the last couple of years, and I don't think anyone expected EVs to have essentially just a clear path and have exponential growth. It's not. I don't think that's likely or to be expected, because we do have a lot of other factors that are currently playing into it, like the socioeconomic factors mainly, and so we had a lot of luck, I guess, or a lot of benefits initially, getting people into EVs, and it's starting to slow up a little bit. But even in Australia, we have been up until now basically been relying on Tesla, and you can essentially see when a Tesla ship, or when no ships come in a quarter, basically, because all EV sales are down. And I get the numbers on registration numbers for EVs, and you can actually see the introduction of both the Model 3 and the Model Y, because that's when the kind of the arrow, or the number of vehicle sales kind of shoot up every time like a new Tesla model is introduced. So it is, my prediction, probably be between 12 and 13% this year in total of sales. And then as we stack up things like vehicle to grid starts coming on board, we start having some good products out there, as well as good models and retail offers as well on vehicle to grid. We'll again just make the case for EVs, and more people will realize that, hey, I've got a solar on my roof, I can charge my car for free, I don't have to pay for petrol, and it'll run my house. Like it starts stacking up all of these benefits that at some point, as I said, you'll only buy an internal combustion car if you like the broom sound.
Yeah, that's right. And so you reckon, what, 25% by 2027, 2028, and then 50%? When do you think we'll hit those sort of magic markers?
I suspect probably sooner. I wouldn't be surprised if we hit 25% in 2 to 3 years, because it's as I said, the way the prices are going, the way the technology is going, and even the battery technology is getting better and better. It's going to be pretty impressive. And at some point, we're going to end up like Norway, where they call internal combustion engine cars fossil cars. I think is quite apt, because they're probably going to go extinct.
That's right. I can't wait for that. Thank you, Bjorn. Really enjoyed the conversation. Great to have you on, and hopefully I'll see you up in Brisbane again, maybe in the next few months. Who knows?
Sounds good. Cheers.
Thanks.